So, good morning. My name is David Ignatius. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, and I want to welcome you to our morning session. The title, as you know from your programs, is Why Victory Against Terrorism Demands Shared Values. And you might, as a member of the audience, respond, yes, but what shared values? And I'm hoping that our panel members, who are all deeply involved in this struggle, will be able to help answer that question. The stage was set for our panel earlier this morning by the UN Secretary General in remarks that you may have heard when he said that terrorism is a threat to peace, not simply in the attacks against individuals and targets, but in its ability to divide the world and exacerbate tensions. Secretary General Annan also mentioned his worry that in the war against terrorism, there is a danger of the loss of civil liberties. And I know that those are questions that will be on your minds as you prepare questions for our group. We're hoping today in this discussion with people who really are experts on the front lines of this battle to talk about what common ground there is in this war against terrorism, and also, frankly, to discuss differences and concerns that people have. One important task set for us is to discuss what we mean by the phrase war against terrorism. The clearer and sharper the definition of that is, the more likely victory will be. Another thing that we hope to do with this unusual group of experts is to discuss what are the next steps in this war against terrorism. Where is it going? Where do the people shaping strategy, thinking deeply about it, hope to take this struggle? So let me introduce our panelists in the order in which I'm going to ask them to speak on these questions. To my immediate right, John Ashcroft, who is Attorney General of the United States. To his right, Alexander Downer, who is Foreign Minister of Australia, and who just told me that on his way here he stopped in Los Angeles for Australia Week, where he played golf with Greg Norman. So we're all very envious of Minister. Well, shocking that you lost to Greg Norman. To my right is Governor Shintaro Ishihara, Governor of Tokyo, the only city that I know of that's actually experienced a biological warfare attack, who can, I'm sure, tell us many useful things that Tokyo has learned. And he was also the author of a book that I'm sure many of you have heard about that made an enormous impact in Japan, called A Japan That Can Say No. And to his left, His Royal Highness Prince Turki al-Faisal al-Saud, who is chairman of the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Saudi Arabia, who is a former chief of Saudi intelligence and is now Saudi Arabia's ambassador to London. So, gentlemen, let me ask you all to address the topic in turn, and let me ask General Ashcroft to lead us off.
Let me say thank you for this opportunity to engage in this kind of discussion, and I think it's fundamental and important. I'm charmed by the fact that people from all over the world would come together in a forum. The format of a forum is predicated on the idea that things can be done when we exchange ideas, when we literally put concepts into the marketplace, and based on their merit, we subscribe to them or modify them or reject them. And in a very significant way, I think that's the way the world ought to operate. The format of exchange is the format of freedom. The format of imposition happens to be the format, in my judgment, of terrorism, where instead of offering ideas in the marketplace of exchange, individuals or groups of individuals seek to impose ideas, not to offer ideas for discussion or modification or negotiation, but having repudiated that way of doing business, that ideas would somehow be susceptible to imposition as a result of either extortion by taking captive or hostage through fear or otherwise of individuals and then imposing an agenda. So let me just begin by saying how important it is for us to recognize the value of a format of exchange rather than a format of imposition. And I don't want to seek to preempt the issue, but I believe that's at the very basis of the issue. The horrific attacks that have been launched against people around the globe in every hemisphere and on virtually every landmass by those who reject the idea of the marketplace of ideas. They have touched us all, from Tokyo's subway attack in 1995 to the bombing of the nightclubs in Bali, to the housing complexes in Saudi Arabia, which took the lives of innocent citizens. These are not soldiers on a battlefield. These are not individuals who are part of an armed conflict. These are citizens who were simply savaged in the process of seeking to achieve an order based on the format of imposition rather than the format of exchange. None of the nations that is represented in this forum really can defeat terrorism alone. Perhaps it was more difficult for the United States to come to a realization that it couldn't do something alone than for other jurisdictions. I don't know if that's the case, but we know in no uncertain terms that we are incapable of having the kind of success alone that we could have working together to preserve a format of exchange and freedom in resisting a format of imposition. And terrorism is a global threat. It's not limited by any international border or geographic border. And the globalization of the world has brought this to us in stark and irresistible terms. As we've seen again and again, terrorists frequently capitalize on the opportunity to have a multi-jurisdictional or a multinational, transnational operation. In the case of the terrorism against the United States on 9/11, if you follow the evidentiary trail, as is sometimes the custom of lawyers to do, the evidence goes from Afghanistan to this different place in the world for funding, a different place in the world for planning, different places all across the United States for training, then for plan modification, redesign, and fine-tuning on another side of the world, and then back to the United States to various geographies from which a plot would eventually be launched. Geography could be no more diverse than it is in that setting, and it tells us that the entire world is in a position both to be concerned about and to make a difference in the fighting the war on terror. I believe that the primary value that should unite us is that values should be developed and spoken of in a format of exchange, not a format of imposition. There are times when we have to resist those who would seek to impose their values, and obviously there are times when there are wars as a result of people who are aggressive or who have deployed their resources in ways that threaten the freedom or the format of exchange of the world generally. But I submit to you that that's a fundamental value. I would submit one other thing, and I don't know if my time is running out, but there is an important value, and it is the universality of human dignity. Throughout the ages, when individuals have felt that either ethnicity or belief devalues part of human existence so that it can be discriminated against or even exterminated, as we've seen in history, that provides an excuse for people to abandon the kind of marketplace and to say that they are eligible for impositions instead of exchanges. I think that is that kind of extremism that says that one group of individuals or one set of individuals is superior to others because of either their ethnicity or that they devalue others because of their beliefs is one of the things that makes terrorism a very, very challenging foe. So as we work together to protect this format of exchange or freedom where people subscribe based on the merit and their willingness to subscribe to ideas, we do it through organizations, whether it's the UN, the OAS, the EU, the G8, the Asian Pacific Group, a variety of others. And I'm pleased to be here to reaffirm the United States' commitment to the kinds of shared values that these institutions help us protect, to reinforce the understanding that in freedom and the marketplace of ideas, in the format of exchange, that we are most successful in respecting the liberty that indeed not only recognizes human dignity but provides a basis for human achievement.
Thank you very much, Attorney General. And now, Foreign Minister Danner.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity of being able to talk today about this issue because it means a lot to us in Australia, given our geographic proximity to Indonesia, the world's largest Islamic country, and the number of Australians who have been killed in terrorist incidents ranging from 9/11 through to Bali and even in Riyadh and Istanbul. I think the first part of this discussion really needs to define what we're really talking about when it comes to terrorism, and I think it's perhaps understood here we're not referring to all aspects of terrorism, the IRA type or Tamil Tigers or ETA or whatever it may be, but what we're talking about here is the al-Qaeda, or in Southeast Asia, Jamaat Islamiyah variant of terrorism, which is multinational, is globalized terrorism. And we need to ask ourselves what these people are really trying to achieve. In our submission, what they're trying to achieve is to impose a particular extremist variant of Islam onto Islamic countries themselves and to attack the West as the part of the world that provides support to regimes in the Islamic world that they see as apostate regimes, heretical regimes, regimes that don't implement what they perceive to be the true meaning and the true interpretation of Islam. And I think it needs to be understood that that's what this ultimately is about. I mean, I think they would like to see the overthrow, first and foremost, of the regime in Saudi Arabia. They'd like to see the destruction of the regimes in the Gulf states. They want to impose a Taliban-style regime throughout the Islamic world, and attacking the West, weakening the West's influence in the Islamic world is part of their objectives. I don't think that is always understood. In Indonesia, for example, they want to destroy the democratic regime of President Megawati and put in place some kind of Taliban-style regime throughout Islamic Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. That leads me to the second point, which is that these acts of terror are therefore acts conducted against all of us. It is Westerners who have suffered, but it's also a large number of Muslims. More Muslims have been killed by these terrorists than Westerners have been killed by them. And therefore we all have to respond in a cooperative and constructive way. Now, in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, we're taking steps to do that. Our country is working very closely with the Indonesians in trying to track down the Jamaat Islamiyah network. Next month, Australia and Indonesia are co-hosting a regional ministerial summit on counter-terrorism to try to coordinate the activities of the Asia-Pacific countries, the Asia-Pacific governments to counter-terrorism. I think this is fundamentally important, A, to understand what these terrorists are trying to achieve, B, to make sure that there's an effective, coordinated, multinational response to dealing with that problem, which embraces Western countries, Islamic countries, and indeed others. The third point I'd make is that, certainly looking at it from our point of view in Australia, adjacent as we are to the world's largest Islamic country, the problem is a problem of perception. I think there is a major problem with perception. I think in the Islamic world, the war against terrorism is by some people, not by the governments, but by, if you like, the street, interpreted as a war against Islam, is interpreted as being anti-Islamic. And the challenge for the West is to demonstrate that that's not what the West is about. What the West is about is, on the contrary, supporting Islamic countries against the activities of extremists who are destroying those or endeavouring to destroy those societies and destroy progress in those societies. In the West, I think, again, not amongst governments, but in some sections of the community, there's also a negative perception about Islam that has come out of terrorism. A view that every time a Muslim walks into the room, you ask yourself, is that person a terrorist? This is absolutely preposterous thing for people to think, to assert, to allege. But that is a problem of perception. So I think the greatest challenge is understanding what these terrorists are trying to do, understanding that we're all targets of these terrorists, and trying to work out more effective and creative ways, not just to building cooperation between governments and government agencies and institutions, because a lot of that work is happening now and is increasingly proving to be successful, but making sure at the broader community level in the West and in the Islamic world there's a better understanding of that cooperation and what we're trying to achieve. Now, I can only really give you the example of Australia. We have spent, we being the Prime Minister, myself, other senior ministers, but also other leading sections of the Australian community in business and in academia, we spent a lot of time sitting down with the leaders of the major Islamic organisations in Indonesia. Now, there are two. There's NU and Muhammadiyah. They have a very big percentage of the population of Indonesia as their members. And we spent a lot of time talking with these people, both Indonesia, and we brought some of the leaders to Australia to sit with us and talk to us about our perceptions and the problems in relation to terrorism. And this is starting to have, I wouldn't overclaim here, this is starting to have some effect. When President Bush visited Bali very briefly in, I think, November last year, he did something that I thought was a very smart thing. He invited the leaders of these two Islamic organisations that I've just spoken of to come and meet with him in Bali, which they duly did. And he spent, twice as much time with them as has been scheduled in his program. And I've spoken to these leaders since then. It's had an enormous impact on these people. No, they don't always agree with President Bush. They didn't agree with the war in Iraq and so on. But the impact of that type of dialogue with those sorts of people is simply enormous. So I think that's, when it comes to shared values, that brings me to my conclusion, and that is that it's pretty obvious, I think, to people who understand comparative religions and the history of the evolution of different religions around the world that they share a very large number of common values. There's no question of that. There aren't religions that go out and advocate murder. There aren't religions that go and support terrorist acts against innocent civilians. Nobody's come across such a religion. So I think there are an enormous number of shared values here. But there has to be shared understanding and shared perceptions, and more work needs to be done to achieve that.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And now let me turn to Governor Ishihara from Tokyo.
実は私は3年前の9月
In September, 3 years ago, in the month of September.
Are you ready?
Is the voice of interpreter coming through?
Yes.
In fact, 3 years ago, on the 11th of September, I was in Washington, D.C. One day prior to the 11th, I went to Pentagon and I had a meeting with Mr. Wolfowitz. And the next day, I was scheduled to have several people from White House. That was the appointment. Then, on the morning of the 11th, my secretary woke me up and I watched TV. And then World Trade Center building was in flame. And then I thought there was a fog weather in New York. And then that was my question. And I actually saw what I saw on the screen, and there was a blue sky. And then the second aircraft crashed at the World Trade Center. Immediately, I realized that it was the act of terrorism. And I opened up the curtain of my bedroom. And then the Pentagon that I had visited the day before was in flame, in smoke. I actually saw Pentagon in flame. Pentagon is a low-rise building, and the major big aircraft hit such a low-rise building. And I thought that was more shocking to the Americans than the fact of terrorism itself. And then I was straddled in the United States for several days. I heard that there were about 8,000 aircrafts in the air, and then Federal Emergency Management Agency, or whichever organization, had a very convenient and a very organized way of landing all aircrafts in the air. And there was one airplane remaining in the air, and that must have been targeting White House or Pentagon. But anyway, this was shot down. But it was a wonderful, outstanding management. More than 10 years ago, I was still a Diet member. There was a extreme cult group called Aum Shinrikyo, and they had the subway sarin attack, and they killed many people in this act of terrorism. It is a fanatic, extreme religious group. But actually, 2 years prior to that subway attack, they had so many people from their cult running in the national election. Of course, they had a miserable defeat. But somehow, they thought that they can participate in the election, and they could select some Diet members, and but it was a miserable defeat. And probably because of the defeat, they went on the act of terrorism several years afterwards. They were guided by the notion of Armageddon, the big chaos which should be brought into this world, and the world should come to an end. That was the purpose of this extreme religious cult group. In other words, in Tokyo, or in Japan for that matter, disorder and confusion should be brought. That was the major aim of this cult group. Currently, in Iraq, we have a certain situation. The acts of terrorism go on, and if you analyze those acts, well, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, it is not only perpetrated by the remaining factions of Saddam Hussein. The ordinary citizens sometimes participate in the act of terrorism, and they have their own weapon, and they just use them. Now, who are the targets? Of course, Americans, American military forces, and then the Allied forces, or the coalition forces. Japanese self-defense force is dispatched, so Japan will be the target of the act of terrorism, and then the Caucasians, Christians, and then Red Cross people, United Nations personnel. And then very interesting thing is that some Arab people and those people belonging to different sects of Islamic religion, and then other Arab people who do not grow beard, men without beard, and also immoral women not acting properly, behaving properly. These people are the subjects of attack by these people. In Tokyo, we experienced an act of terrorism just like that. If you sort of summarize, the point is disorder and chaos. That's what they want to introduce to the situation in Iraq, or for that matter, for the entire world. They want to cause chaos and utter disorder. I think that is the sole aim of terrorism. The purpose of terrorism in today's world. Perhaps sometimes they are not without any clear political aims. They don't have clear ideas of what kind of government they want to create. They want to bring about chaos and disorder. I think that is the grand premise of the acts of terrorism. It is a great trouble for all those ordinary people like us. And it is something that cannot be tolerated in today's society. Now, killing immoral women, maybe I can understand, perhaps, but some extreme people, Arabists, if you will, some extreme people, they say that they don't need to be educated. The women should not go to schools. So it is almost insulting the mankind itself in that notion. Going beyond sects and orders and cultural differences for the sake of mankind, I think we should stand against any movement which professes disorder and confusion. I had an opportunity to meet Professor Huntington in one of those World Economic Forum meetings. And this act of terrorism is not necessarily the conflict between Islamic civilization and a Christian civilization, but the world is becoming smaller temporally and spatially. That is what we see the world as it is. There is a gap between the rich and the poor. And the living conditions are so different, and it is a stark reality, and it can be communicated visually, and it is communicated so easily in today's world. And because of that, there are certain reactionary sentiment that is brewed. And that could be the trigger of certain acts. But today's kind of terrorism, is it shortening the gap of the rich and poor? It may be one of the slogans, but in fact, their acts themselves would not shorten the gap between the rich and the poor. Rather, I will say that we have a conference like this, and we discuss the possible threat of terrorism, and we all share certain danger and risks, the sense of crisis. And if this is expanded, then there could be led into the major force which will shorten the gap of the rich and the poor. One example is the sending of the forces by Japan that is assisting the rehabilitation of Iraq. I think this could be a new model of cooperation for filling the gap between the rich and the poor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor Ishihara. And now let me turn to Prince Turki.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I agree with General Ashcroft that terrorism and terrorists try to be supranational and super-religious and even super-ideological. They cut across all of these things in our society today. And they do that for political reasons, in order to achieve political aims. And they also, another hallmark of terrorists, I think, is that they try to expropriate people's struggles and people's ideals for themselves. So when somebody, as was in the 70s, the Baader-Meinhof group or the Italian Red Brigades espoused the humanistic and better improvement for society in the West ideals that were there, they used terrorism as a means of saying to people that we're trying to achieve this good for you. And today we see something like al-Qaeda expropriating a whole religion in terms of saying that this is Islam and the rest of us in the world are infidels and kafirs who should not only be persecuted, but in many cases allowed to be killed for the sake of political aims. And His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of Australia, put the dots on the I's, as it were, in saying that the aims of al-Qaeda today are the overthrow of Islamic countries, primarily Saudi Arabia, even before affecting America or Europe or other places. So these are things I think that all of us in the world community not only recognize, but also are fortunately working together to oppose. What I think where we fail in the worldwide action against terrorism is in combating and defining what is terrorism. You can't simply have a war against an idea by purely military or police means. You have to know what that idea is, and you have to oppose it with ideas. if there are young people in the Muslim and Arab world today who become the tools of terrorism, it's because they have been convinced that this is the means to achieve whatever aims they have. And it is incumbent upon us, not just in the Arab and Muslim world, but in the worldwide community altogether, to propose the ideas that oppose these convictions and ideals that these people have espoused. And in order to do that, we have to know what are these ideals and who they are and who's propagating them. I am truly at a loss to explain how something like a United Nations Convention on what terrorism is has not succeeded in defining what terrorism is. Each country has its own definition. I know that in the West, in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, in Italy, etc., in Germany, they define what terrorism and they act upon that definition. We in the Arab world have successfully, I think, negotiated a convention on terrorism that is signed onto by all 22 Arab countries. In the Organization of Islamic Countries, there is a clear definition accepted by more than 54 countries, which are members of that organization, defining what terrorism is. So how is it not possible for the worldwide community to bring all of these definitions that people have in their minds of what terrorism is and put it down on paper and have everybody sign up on it? When September 11th occurred, I think there was a great opportunity missed by the President of the United States at that time. If he had stood up, in my view, and called on the world community to come together with him and the United States and the people of the United States who suffered this great loss at the time, and said, let us all sign up to this war on terrorism, I think all of the world community, through the United Nations, would have signed up a blank check, as it were, on how to fight that scourge and that issue of terrorism. Regardless of what happened, the world community came up and stood with the United States in its fight against terrorism, and that was to be expected, and that was the natural thing for human beings to do. But defining the values that we share with each other, I think, comes in as much as we can define what it is we are fighting in the world. Nobody should misunderstand or misjudge or misinterpret people when they say that terrorism is wrong, period. There is absolutely no justification for anybody to take innocent lives for whatever purpose in the world. I think that is a shared value among all of us. I think another shared value is that we must provide all necessary means to combat the taking of innocent lives for whatever purpose. And another shared value I believe that I've seen in practice and so on is that in trying to achieve these aims, that we must accept that there are those who can provide us among ourselves in the world community with more help than others. And this is also another shared, maybe it's not a value, but a shared practice, that an exchange of information and exchange of capabilities and so on, that there are some who are more capable than others. I think another thing that we have to identify and reach a common value about is what the governor of Tokyo mentioned about that group in Japan, is that they are a cult. And I believe all terrorist groups are cults. Al-Qaeda has the exemplar example of being a cult. It is developed around a personality that preaches a certain ideology and that demands self-sacrifice for the purpose of achieving its aims. If you look back on history and see how all the cults that have come about in the world, they've had these similar traits to them. And definitely Al-Qaeda is a cult. And the way to combat Al-Qaeda and to combat other terrorist groups is to fight their ideology. It is not enough for a country like Saudi Arabia to arrest 100 or 200 or 300 people, put them in jail, and take them to court, etc., and pass sentences on them where they will stay 10, 15, or whatever years in jail. These people and their ideology has to be combated by a counter-ideology that shows that not only is terrorism unacceptable as a means of achieving anything, but also that there is an alternative to these practices that are instilled in the members of these cults. And I just hope that the world community, when it reflects and asks individual beings in the world today to strive to combat terrorism, that more and more of these shared values could be brought together in a convention for all of us to sign up to, defining what terrorism is and allowing us as a world community to do whatever we can in combating that terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prince Turki. I want to turn this over to the audience in just a few moments, but to give you a chance to think of questions, I want to take my privilege as moderator to ask a couple of my own. And I want to start with Attorney General Ashcroft, and in the spirit of frank exchange that you cited in your opening remarks, to put the frankest possible question to you. There are many people in the world, and I'm sure there are many here at this gathering, who would fear that the Bush administration is diverging from the shared values that are part of the international community and are concerned about that. One sees polls that cite President Bush as a threat to peace, which are surprising, I'm sure, to you, but reflect something that's out there. And I want to ask you, as Attorney General and a member of the administration, how you respond to that kind of concern expressed in the world community.
President Bush, I think more than anything else, is a person who seeks peace and respects freedom. And if you look at the United States and its performance and where it is in the world and what it does in the world, it's not an aggressor. The United States doesn't seek to consume territory or to acquire an empire. That when it operates in defense of freedom, it is quick to try and reinforce that freedom for the benefit of the individuals with whom it has joined forces. I think this is true over and over again, and is part of the American story in the 20th century, and I think is clearly where America is in the 21st century. At the conclusion of the Second World War, it was not the intention of the United States of America to somehow dominate Europe. It was the conclusion or intent of the United States to revitalize Europe and its substantial commitment, the Marshall Plan and a variety of other situations. And I think this is, pretty clear if you look in evidence around the world. If you go today to the nation of Iraq, it's the intention of the United States of America to allow the Iraqi people to run Iraq with the stated goal of having Iraqi determination and Iraqi governance by the middle part of this year, the end of June. That is a very aggressive timetable, reflecting not only the President of the United States in his very substantial commitment to self-determination and freedom of individuals to operate in a context that respects human dignity, but it's one that I think is consistent with our history. Some people have questions about the United States' presence in Iraq at all, but I think you have to put that in the context of why the United States was there in the first place. And if we look back a decade ago, when Saddam Hussein invaded the nation of Kuwait, the United States came to do what it could to allow those people to be free and repelled the forces of the Iraqi army from that jurisdiction. It wasn't that the United States sought to take over Kuwait. It was the liberation of Kuwait. And similarly, when the conditions of that ceasefire were totally disrespected in Iraq and by Saddam Hussein, it was that which became the predicate and the necessity for the United States to act against a leader capable, willing, with a demonstrable willingness and capability of deploying very, very serious weapons against humanity, both inside his own borders and outside his own borders, that caused the United States to be where it is. But if the United States were an aggressor nation seeking somehow to create empire as a result of its deployment of its own resources of force, I think you would expect to see the United States with a different influence in Europe as a result of the history of the last century. You'd expect to see the United States with a far different influence in Kuwait, for instance, as it relates to the experience of the last decade. And I think if you look not just a decade from now, but by the end of this year and next year, you'll see the United States not seeking to dominate, not seeking to impose, but seeking to provide as a basis of human achievement and experience, provide liberation and the opportunity for self-determination and self-governance, which we expect to operate in Iraq. And absent a proliferation of successful terror, which we don't believe will be successful, we believe it is being curtailed, the Iraqi people will have an opportunity to govern themselves in a way they have not before been able to do so, in peace rather than as aggressors.
Thank you very much. I have one more moderator's question, and that's for Prince Turki. Prince Turki, you know well that sharing of intelligence is a crucial part of the war against terrorism. And yet mistrust between nations, mistrust, for example, between the United States and Saudi Arabia, can sometimes be an obstacle to sharing precisely the information that would make both safer. How can one deal with that problem, specifically in the case of the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and more generally?
I believe the perception that there is mistrust between the United States and Saudi Arabia is misplaced. As far as I know, the American administration and Saudi government are working hand in hand in this issue and sharing all the intelligence that has been gathered over the years. When I was Director of Intelligence in Saudi Arabia, I know that we had a joint committee with the United States on the issue of terrorism since 1997, in which all aspects of intelligence were shared, including the issues of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and other terrorist activities that were taking place at that time. As far as I know, that committee is still standing today and is meeting regularly in both the United States and Saudi Arabia. But more than that, I know that there is very close cooperation between the Kingdom and the United States in the field of the, as it were, finding the financial resources or tracking the financial resources of whether it is al-Qaeda or any other group or individual who may be involved in support of al-Qaeda. And there is another standing committee there between the United States and Saudi Arabia, which is this time meeting in Saudi Arabia all the time. So there is no mistrust between the leadership in Saudi Arabia and the leadership in the United States on the federal level. Mr. Ashcroft perhaps can comment on that better than I can, because he's in the midst of these things and I'm away in London. But this is the impression that I have. One thing I would like to add here, which is something to my opening statement, is that these cults, these terrorist cults, not only try to expropriate the ideals and values of people, but also they try to use, and they thrive on the perception of other people suffering of expropriation. Expropriation of liberty, of property, of territory, etc. And the danger as an example of that is what is happening in Palestine. The perception that the Israeli colonization of Palestine is going to remain forever and in constant expansion, with more colonies being built in Palestine and more territory being taken by the Israelis, whether through the wall or through other means, allows terrorists to thrive on these injustices and these happenings in places like Palestine. And it is used to put bombs around a young lady's waist and have her walk to an Israeli checkpoint and explode herself. Now, that is not the right way to do it in my view, but the people who convinced her to do that obviously used what is happening in Palestine as a way of justifying the fact that she will sacrifice her life that way. And other similar incidents that have taken place in other places in the world have used the expropriation of people's rights, whether they be to territory or nationality or identity, as a means of perpetrating and propagating terrorism.
Attorney General Ashcroft, why don't you briefly respond to the comments from Prince Turki, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for your questions.
Well, let me just say that I don't purport to respond to all of his comments, but as it relates to the relationship and cooperation between the government of Saudi Arabia and the United States of America, we are grateful for the level of cooperation and opportunity we have to work together. We were appalled and remain appalled at the incidents of terror which strikes innocent life in Saudi Arabia, just as we were when innocent life was taken and struck in New York and in Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania, and as we are when it happens around the world, whether it be in Istanbul or in Bali or any variety of settings, as we were stunned when it happened in Tokyo. So we believe that we have a good working relationship, and we are grateful for the exchange of information. Let me, with a caveat, say that with every nation we seek to continue to improve our capacity. But that's not something that is idiosyncratic or unique to our relationship with Saudi Arabia as it relates to intelligence and the prevention of terror. The United States needs in a very significant way the wholehearted cooperation of our friends and freedom-loving colleagues around the world. And we seek to improve our level. We seek to improve the way we serve others, and we hope that that would be an inspiration for others to seek to improve the way they serve the United States in defeating terror.
Governor Ishihara would also briefly like to respond to this subject.
Secretary Ashcroft mentioned the basic stance of Bush administration, and I give a great credit to that. Bush administration, talking about Bush administration, for the first time, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were named as troublemaking states of the world. It is the first administration which specifies these three countries. Those people who are close to Europe, maybe you are not interested in affairs regarding North Korea. Actually, a country of North Korea for some time. The Scud missile, which no longer is produced by Russia, parts and components thereof are produced and manufactured in North Korea, and they are supplied to Iraq on frequent occasions. And on Indian Ocean, America intercepted the transport of those products on many occasions. Now, Japanese compatriots, from circumstantial evidences, 150 of Japanese citizens were abducted by North Korea, and most of them were murdered, as far as we know. Now, al-Qaeda and other factors. They are causing a lot of terrorism in the world. But many, many years prior to that, the Koreans resident in Japan were used as operative. And during the time of President Park, he was attacked and he was saved. But Mrs. Park was killed on this incident perpetrated by an operative of Korean living in Japan. And also there was a Korean airline incident which was shot above Indian Ocean. And there were several Korean ministers paying a visit to a temple in Myanmar. And then a bomb was placed in the temple and a lot of them were killed. And that was also perpetrated by the elements of North Korea. So North Korea is a very dangerous and troublesome country. And such a country exists in the Far East. I hope you understand, the people in the audience. Of course, Japan has a certain capability. So if a government tries to make its will known, then we can stand against it. But somehow we were unable to do so. Because the Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party, of course, they do not have the majority in the political arena in Japan, but they had certain relationship with North Korea, and they benefited in many ways from North Korea, I guess. So the leaders of these political parties consistently said that there is no case of abduction. Only very recently, the Kim Jong-il, the leader of North Korea, said and apologized that the act of abduction was done, and it was done during the days of his father, and the people were punished for that, and he wanted to have economic assistance in place in exchange for the apology. But I wonder why Japan does not go for economic sanction. I have told the Japanese government so many times. So Tokyo on its own took certain measures. They are not paying tax in occupying certain buildings, North Koreans. So we took measure so that they will pay taxes. And we said that the building will be put into tender if they don't pay tax. It cannot be called an economic sanction. It is a legal matter that we should have been following. So I am asserting that economic sanction should be taken by the national government of Japan. In the earlier election, this question was posed by the families of abductees, and then 90% of the Diet members said that Japan should go for economic sanction. Somehow, however, Japanese government never takes measures for that. It is not something that we need somebody's assistance. It is the matter of the will of the central government. Strong will must be expressed by any state. That is my belief. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Ishihara. Now I want to turn it over to the audience. Let me ask you, please, to raise your hands, to identify yourselves, and please keep your questions brief. We have only a short time, and please state the person you would like to answer your question. Yes, here in the first row, please.
Faisal Abdurraouf from New York City. Mr. Ashcroft, I'm an American citizen and a Muslim. I love the values of America, and I love the values of my faith. However, I'm pained by the increasing divide between the United States and the Muslim world. The war against terrorism has at least two fronts. One is the front that we have been speaking about today, and the other one is winning the hearts and minds of people all over the world. And my fear is that all the evidence, as David had just indicated, citing polls that he has cited, tends to indicate that the wall and the divide between the Muslim world and America is increasing, not decreasing. I would therefore like to call upon you and upon our administration to articulate a vision that perhaps would recall the four freedoms of FDR or the rights of Wilson addressed to the Muslim street and to the Muslim world, which provides a vision of how the United States intends to project its powers towards the Muslim world in a way that would resonate with their aspirations and their values. Absent that, Mr. Ashcroft, I'm not convinced that we might win the war against terrorism. One comment to you, David. You had suggested yesterday that we should call upon you whenever we feel shortcomings of the media. barely a month ago, I was part of an interreligious initiative which was called on my calling to request the religious leaders from the Abrahamic community to call upon our president to really make a strong effort to resolve the Arab-Israeli problem. We had Cardinal McCarrick, the Cardinal of Washington, D.C.
Let me just ask, you and I should discuss this afterwards, and let's let Attorney General Ashcroft answer your good question, okay?
Very well. Okay. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I thank you for the question. Really, you've indicated that you think it's appropriate and beneficial if the United States can improve its ability to signal to people around the world, to people of the Islamic faith in particular, what the values are which you hold so dear as an American. And we seek to do that not only around the world, but we seek to do it in the United States. I know the President has met with Islamic and Muslim individuals in America, in mosques and the like, and I have done the same. We need to improve our performance and are interested in finding ways to do that. We believe, as I think was stated clearly by Prince Turki, that you can't win the war without having people understand ideas that are important. And the ideas that you mentioned, whether we characterize them or package them as the four freedoms as expressed in the 1930s or in some novel or new way, these are very important. America stands for human dignity of every individual. We stand for the sanctity of humanity and the fact that it is to be regarded highly. We stand for the freedoms of individuals to believe what they would believe. That's why I said in the beginning that one of the shared beliefs must be that we don't devalue anyone for what they believe or where they were born or their ethnic origin. And the successful communication of this is very important. In particular, as it relates to the communication of this to the Islamic population of the world, I would hope that individuals such as yourselves could be a part of this, who could be testimony to the fact that the United States has welcomed people of the Islamic faith, and that in the United States there is freedom for people of the Islamic faith, and that it has been a place where people of the Islamic faith and understanding have been allowed to succeed, and that they have been allowed to raise their children in ways that are consistent with their beliefs. I think these are things that are misunderstood around the world, and there would be no more credible voice to communicate that to the world community than individuals such as yourself in the United States, who can give testimony to the freedom and respect that the United States accords to people of all faiths and religions.
Thank you. Sigmund in the second row.
Sigmund Sternberg, thank you for calling on me, Michael. I know why you did, because you know I'm very short. First of all, let me start. Mr. Downer, a good friend of mine is Michael Strange, Australian High Commissioner. Now, he's very interested in my work. I'm engaged in interface activity. He comes to all my meetings. Mr. Ashcroft, Bill Farish, your ambassador in London, is again very much interested in interface work, and he helps me a great deal. Whenever I call Bill Farish, he either comes or he sends a representative. Here in Japan, we've got Riseko Sekai, Mr. Nivano, who is doing a great deal of interface activity. What business people could do and what business people could help is to help with this interface dialogue. In this very room, I can only detect one businessman. I hope I won't embarrass him, and that is Mr. Mallinckrodt. I mean, you see, the great problem is that business people do not seem to very much interested in the work, because I don't think they understand what we are doing. But business people can be of great help to us, because business people are influential. I mean, they have got influence in universities, they've got influence in media, and I very much urge you, that business people should get involved. In July, we shall have a Parliament of World Religion in Lisbon, but I hope business people will come, and that is the only way they can help us, because they've got the know-how how to make things happen.
Minister Downer, do you want to respond to that?
I just want to respond in one respect. First of all, I appreciate very much the work you're doing in promoting interfaith dialogue. We in Australia have done a lot to try to enhance interfaith dialogue with the Muslim nations and communities in Southeast Asia, as well as within our own country, which has a very substantial Islamic minority, part and parcel of the way our society works. But I think with this interfaith dialogue, what is important is to broaden it. Too much of the current structure of interfaith dialogue is, if you like, and I say this the nicest possible way, elitist. Academics, distinguished academics, politicians, business leaders. Well, that's all good. I'm not against any of that. I promote it. But we've got to find ways of getting this dialogue into the mainstreams of our societies, Islamic societies. And that is a tremendously difficult challenge. And I think really you have to use the media as best you can to do that. But you know what the media are like. They have their own agendas, and they, of course, are very driven by infotainment rather than necessarily just promoting the facts. So it's always difficult to use the media as a vehicle, but getting the dialogue into the mainstreams of societies is going to be one of the great challenges for the next few years.
Yes, I want to turn to the woman in the red directly back there. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to return to a comment made by Mr. al-Saud concerning the U.S. response after 9/11. In the dust of 9/11, there was this one extraordinary moment where I think the world recognized its common humanity. And my question to you is, why did the administration choose not to aggressively pursue bringing the world together, working through the United Nations at that moment? To many people in the world and to some people in the U.S., it didn't look like we seized the moment to bring the world together. So my first question is, why didn't we aggressively work on bringing them together?
Let me ask you, because our time is very short, to keep it to the one so that others can ask questions too.
Oh, my only question is, and if you did try to do that, what might you have done better?
May I please respond? I am at a lack of capacity to understand the premise that the United States didn't seek to enlist the world. Certainly, a great deal of my existence has been involved in seeking to enlist the world in assisting the United States and seeking to offer the world offer the United States in assistance to people around the world who have been the victims of terror. My privilege is to serve as the leader of the Justice Department, and included in that department are the component agencies of the FBI and the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and explosives, and various law enforcement. And we have had, I think, not only sought assistance from and sought to mobilize the resources of others in helping us, but we've offered assistance. And I know we've had our experts in working in analysis for specific incidents literally around the world. So I would take exception to the idea that somehow the United States sought to go it alone. I do think that 9/11 was a defining moment, and I think it changed the world, but it did change the United States significantly as well. And I think it's been very clear to us, and I think I stated in my opening statement that we are not able to do with nearly the success alone that we could have if we worked together. So my view is that the President invited the help and assistance of others, and we've tried to be as generous as possible in providing assistance, whether the bombing would be in Riyadh or whether the bombing would be in Bali. Our experts have been offered and have been on the scene and working to provide assistance, and we are eager to work together. And I have traveled extensively since that time as the law enforcement official to make that assistance known in a very tangible way around the world.
Can I just add?
Yes.
As somebody not from the United States, from one of these foreign countries, which sometimes you have a perception the international community's at variance with the United States. Look, on the issue of terrorism, the United States did go to the United Nations, and resolutions were passed through the Security Council. I don't think we should forget that. And secondly, I think there is very broad support across the international community, and Prince Turki made this point, in relation to Saudi Arabia, for what the Americans are doing and for what more broadly the international community is doing to counter terrorism. I wouldn't let that get too confused with the issue of Iraq. Sure, there were divisions over the issue of Iraq, but you wouldn't want to exaggerate that either. There's an enormous amount of support around the world, you know, for the liberation of Iraq. There aren't a lot of people around the world who think this world would be a better place if Saddam Hussein were to return as the dictator of Iraq. Not many people think that.
Let me turn to, if that's Ron, I'm not sure, turn to you and then to the woman just behind you who had her hand up earlier. Yes.
Thank you, David. My question, more in the way of clarification than a question, is for Prince Turki. You referred to the woman who strapped on explosives and blew herself up the other day. And it was in the context of cults expropriating causes for people. Now, that particular bombing was claimed by Hamas. Now, I'm sure, at least I think I am, that you do not think of Hamas as a cult. But given the context of your remarks, regardless of the righteousness of a cause, and you said there is no justification for taking innocent life, are we to understand that you thoroughly repute, either tactically or morally, the use of suicide bombers when innocent life is taken, regardless of the cause of the context?
Absolutely, Mr. Silver. And I've said that before many times. I think suicide bombers do not only harm to the people who suffer the immediate death as a result of that, but also do the perpetrators of the suicide bombers the worst damage for whatever aims or purposes that they wish to achieve. So I would absolutely repudiate it completely.
Yes, please.
Yes, it's one question to Mr. Downer. You said that you went to Indonesia where you met with two major Islamic organizations there. I would ask you if you would do the same in Egypt, for instance, while meeting the Muslim Brotherhood. And one question also to Princess Saud. When you said, that you need, to have an ideological battle, against terrorism in Saudi Arabia. Will this mean enhancing the Islamic credential of the state or opening up, your society and making new ideas and attitudes, circulated more freely?
Well, my benchmark for the sorts of groups I meet, make it a general comment rather than specific to any country, is that those religiously oriented groups which wish to promote peace and dialogue and try to establish a proper international consensus of cooperation towards resolving global and national problems are organisations that I'm happy to sit down and talk with. Where there are organisations, though, that choose to use acts of terror and violence to achieve political or religious objectives, I don't do anything to try to give them any comfort, I can assure you. And so that's the benchmark that I use. I'm not going to sit down and engage in a cross-cultural dialogue with al-Qaeda, because I don't think there's any point. I think I just want to, get them all behind bars. But with Muhammadiyah or NU in Indonesia, classic examples of the sort of peace-loving, sensible, constructive Islamic organisations with which people can have really constructive dialogue. That should be the benchmark without getting into other specific organisations.
The gentleman here in the middle, you're far from a microphone, but yes, it can be handed to you.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Basically to Mr. Ashcroft,
And identify yourself, if you would.
Yes, I'm Jamil Mroui. I'm a Lebanese journalist. In describing, and Mr. Downer, in describing in your opening remarks the situation about terrorism, gladly you identified, Mr. Downer, that we're talking about Islamic terrorism. And therefore, the chasm of understanding between generally the West and the Islamic world. And Mr. Ashcroft, I must say that your speech writers are good, whether yourself or in Washington. The projection of wanting for, planning for democracy or aiming for democracy are very good. What we hear from Washington is very nice. But in the theater of operation, in the Middle East, and I'm not going to talk about Palestine, I'm going to talk about Iraq. Here now you say that you want a quick, fast, by June, delivery of Iraq to the free Iraqis. Yet, on the ground, we don't see that work. We don't see it working that way. We see incompetence, we see inconsistency, we see crossed messages, we see bureaucratic bungles. My question to you is, how do we bridge the gap between that which your speechwriters very competently do and your diplomats very incompetently achieve? Thank you.
Well, there's a gentle last question.
Well, one of the ways we do it is with your help. I would say that this is not something that is easy. It's not easy to establish freedom in the midst of terror. And it's not easy. Freedom has never been free. It has always been difficult to achieve, and it's always been difficult to attain. And when it comes to smooth-running government bureaucracies, I'm not sure the United States has any special capacity. We have always had challenges in translating our ideals into reality. But let me just say that the fact that we are not perfect and without flaw in doing so does not dissuade us from pursuing those ideals in the least. And in this respect, we need help. And we are grateful to the dozens of nations that are helping us. They're represented here on this podium, and they're represented across this audience, and they're represented across the world. And the United States has never been able perfectly to achieve its objectives, but it has never made it impossible for the United States to pursue those objectives and to recognize our need for assistance in pursuing them. At the conclusion of the Second World War, there were many inefficiencies and difficulties in the reestablishment of freedom in Europe. But we persisted in spite of the difficulties and in spite of the flaws and failures, so that Europe becomes a place for a forum like this now, where we discuss freedom and we seek to elevate human potential. What a tremendous thing it would be to think that someday a forum could be held like this in Iraq, because the world decided, as it did 50 or 60 years ago, that there would be a light of freedom and discussion that could emanate from Iraq, just like it could from a once war-torn Europe that had been under the heel of an aggressor who exterminated millions of individuals because he believed that there was a differential value in humanity, that some people were more worthy than others. So I would say that the way we're going to get this done is with your help, and with the help of the world community. And it's the only way it's ever been done. And it's never been done perfectly, but that shouldn't dissuade us, because it's been done over and over again imperfectly. And we need patience, and we need assistance, and we need resolve, and we need determination and persistence. It is not the destiny of the United States to be on the sideline when freedom is in the balance. But I think that's too narrow a statement. I don't think it is the destiny of humanity to stand on the sideline when freedom is in the balance. And we need the help of the entirety of the world community in the war against terror and in the war to replace the rule of terror with the rule of law.
I think that's a good point to end it. We're just past noon and we have to clear the hall. I think we'll all go away trying to imagine what Davos in Baghdad would be like. At least we won't have to bring our snow boots. Before we adjourn, I just want to, in 20 seconds, thank all the members of our panel who I think tried to respond very forthrightly to what were good, direct questions. In terms of what I'll take away from this morning's session, certainly Attorney General Ashcroft's statement that no one can do it alone. The United States doesn't seek to do it alone and is looking for help. Couldn't have been said more forthrightly. Foreign Minister Downer stated eloquently that there is a commonality to this fight and that more Muslims have died than have non-Muslims in this terrorist campaign. I was moved by Governor Ishihara's recollection of being in Washington on 9/11 and seeing the destruction of that building, and it reminded us that we really are all here together. And Prince Turki summarized for me clearly when he said that all terrorist groups are cults, just this fanatical core of the enemy that the war on terrorism is about. And I think we were all struck and moved by the directness and forthrightness of his answer to Ron Silver's question about suicide bombing. So I thank all the panelists and thank you for attending.